Good morning. Welcome back from break. Hopefully you have already printed out your note sheet. It should say at the top History of Russia. Have lots of little numbers down the side which are vaguely reminiscent of dates and a few Russian sounding names. So as we go through this PowerPoint, each slide will basically correlate with one of the points on your notes, and so you can then just fill it in and as we advance along, and feel free to stop the video and rewind if you miss something. So going to kind of go quickly until we get up until the 20th century, then we'll slow down a little more, and then we'll do some analysis at the end of just why Russia is the way it has been for the last 20, 25 years or so. So we have to go way back to the ancient Vikings. And in general, if you'll notice on this map, when you think of Vikings, you think of the people who came from around here. And they basically went to like around here and stole stuff and brought it back home. Or they came from here and went to here. Okay, these are the Vikings that eventually made it all the way around to here. They were the ones who were interested in conquest, and they were the ones who would go and kill a bunch of monks, and grab the stuff, and come home. The Vikings on this side, however, they were more interested in trade. And they were basically using these river systems going through here, and you can see how their influence spread down through this area, all the way down to what at that point was the wealthiest part of the world, Constantinople. So the Vikings that basically went east, they weren't as interested in pillage and returning home. They wanted to set up trading situations. They did take a lot of slaves, which is where we get the word Slav from, because they would go through here on their way to Constantinople, capture various slaves, bring them down here and sell them. And so even today, in most Western European languages, we call these people some form of Slav. So these eastern-going Vikings we call Varangians. And the Slavic people called them the Rus. They were the ones who came from here, and as they come along, they would then settle first here, then they would eventually expand out. Now the English word Viking comes from the Norwegian one who vix. So Viking is actually a verb. What are you doing today? Oh, today I am Viking. It means to go and rob and pillage. But the word Rus means a person who rows, because these traders would spend a lot of time rowing up and down the rivers as they're making their money, selling Baltic amber and such like this, and slaves down here, picking up fine things in this area, then selling them back to the people here. So the very first settlement that the Vikings made is a place called Novgorod, which ironically is one of the oldest cities in Russia, and it means new. So Novgorod was founded about here, and it was founded by a fellow by the name of Rurik. We don't necessarily know how historical he was, but he is considered to be the one who founded the Viking Empire, and his dynasty would last until around the time of Ivan the Terrible. So Rurik was followed by a fellow named Oleg of Novgorod, or known as Oleg the Prophet. And he is the one who formed something called the Kievan Rus. This area here was ruled by the Vikings, the Rus, and he founded the city of Kiev. Notice it's much more centrally located. Novgorod is way up here in Scandinavia. Kiev is sort of down halfway between. So Oleg comes along, he conquers this village, makes it his own, the center of his kingdom, and now he is a member of what we call the Kievan Rus, the Vikings from Kiev. And he has an interesting story. There was a prophecy that a certain really nice horse of his would cause his death. And he said, okay, if that's the case, I will never ride this horse. In fact, why don't you send it off to a far province so I'm not even ever going to see it? And the years go by, he doesn't die, he gets old and gray, and eventually he says, so whatever became of that horse that was going to be the cause of my death? And Phil says, oh, it died long ago. And so Oleg says, well, I think I'm going to go and see the bones of this so-called horse that will be my demise. So he goes over, finds the bones, and as he reaches out to sort of push the skull of the horse with his foot, a snake comes out from inside the skull and bites him, and he dies. Yeah, so the lesson is, don't mess with prophecy. So we come then to a more historically known figure, Vladimir I, sometimes known as Vladimir the Great, and he is responsible for bringing Orthodox Christianity to the Vikings, to the Kievan Rus. And the story goes, we're now in 989, that he was looking around and seeing how Europe was developing. You had this massively powerful and important place in Constantinople down in the south. You had Western Europe. This is shortly after, 120 some years after Charlemagne. And so Western Europe is becoming highly advanced. And he says, why are we sitting here as pagans? We should go and look at what the different options are available for us. So he sent out a bunch of wise men, said, research what are the different religious options available to us. Come back and I'll make a choice. So his guys go out and they come back, and those who went to check out Judaism do the report. And Vladimir says, oh, but Judaism was centered on Jerusalem, and the Jews have lost Jerusalem. So obviously that means that they are not the chosen ones of God anymore, so we're not going to do Judaism. And then the group that came and checked out Islam reported back, and he says, wow, there are some appealing things, but they don't eat pork? What are we going to, that would take away half of our feasting. And they forbid alcohol? That seals the deal. Because, to quote him, drinking is the joy of all the Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure. So there's no chance that he's going to choose Islam. And those who went to the West said, well, it's just kind of there. Their churches are kind of boring. And those who went down to visit Eastern Orthodox came back impressed with the tales of the gold and the splendor and the riches of Constantinople. And Vladimir says, okay, I'll choose that one. It's a good story. Probably more accurate is that, if you remember, if we go back to the map here, that he was basically living along this river, and this trading route that went along here was centered on Constantinople. And so as the ruler of Kiev, which is here, it makes sense that he would then do whatever he could to get into the favor of the Byzantine Empire. And so part of the deal when he became an Orthodox Christian is that he got to marry the, I guess you would still call him the emperor of Constantinople's sister. And this was a rare privilege. People from Western Europe had been trying to get her hand, and there was absolutely no interest. So the fact that she would marry off to this, who until that moment had been pagan, was a huge coup for him, both politically and economically. So one of the other big effects that this has today is that when he then chose Eastern Orthodoxy, Slavic became the language of the church. Vladimir himself, his actual name was Valdemar, he spoke Old Norse. And so had he decided to go with the Western Church, it could very well be that you would have had a situation where people today in Eastern Europe speak something more related to Scandinavian than their native Slavic language. But when he chose to become Eastern European or Eastern Orthodox, this meant then that the Slavic language was adopted into the church, and Cyril and Methodius came along and found an alphabet where you could write Slavic based on the Greek, and this then was one of those watershed moments where the culture of that area could have gone either way. And by this point, now from here on, the rulers of the Rus begin more and more to speak Slavic and to identify as Slavic people rather than to identify as Scandinavian Vikings. So in 1054, the Kievan Rus begins to decline. So here's Kiev, and you notice on the Dnieper, this important trade route, and it had expanded to control this huge area. However, subsequent rulers weren't able to hold on to this, they weren't as powerful, and the individual parts began to break away. You had these various little principalities. And even though they were still all supposedly part of the center, they became more and more independent as time went by. And in particular, two things happened. The Northern Crusades, which were mounted against the Baltic states, really disrupted the trade that these groups had with Scandinavia. Because these people here were basically pagan, and then people from the Holy Roman, what would eventually become the Holy Roman Empire, came through here, and they settled in, and they wanted to keep their trade going this direction. You have what eventually became the Hanseatic League, and you had a lot of the wealth of the Baltic flowing this direction instead of this direction. The other thing that was probably even worse for them was the Fourth Crusade, which was supposed to go and attack the Holy Land, but all the Crusaders said, okay, let's meet up in Constantinople. We'll go there and we'll check it out. That'll be sort of we'll get our bearings, we'll get our tents together, and then we'll go off and we'll attack the Holy Land. This is the fourth major crusade. There had been three before. They had conquered some of the Holy Land. They had set up these European kingdoms there. And by this point, they come along and they get to Constantinople filled with wealth, just an amazing place. And they look around and say, you know what? Down there in the Holy Land, it's been conquered, or we've tried to conquer it 3 times, kind of a bunch of dusty desert. But Constantinople, this place here might be worth conquering. And so instead of actually going on their crusade, the Fourth Crusaders just decided, we'll just conquer Constantinople and take all their money. And so these supposed Christians coming out here to help the Constantinople to fight off these Muslim invaders ended up just saying, yeah, whatever, we'll just attack Constantinople. So here you have the Kievan Rus, which is cut off by the Germans to be able to trade here, and they then, now their main trading partner in the south has been ruined by the Fourth Crusade, so they have lost their main source of income, which then, if you're not being wealthy, it makes it more possible for these little further states to break away. So after the Kievan Rus weakens, There's nothing really there to defend themselves against the invaders that come along, the Mongols. So Mongols came in from Central Asia, and they were an unstoppable force. When they came through, they reached up into what is today Russia, and they were not interested in actually conquering them. They didn't stay there and settle, but they did make the rulers of Russia and the rulers of the Kievan Rus pay tribute to them. So you had all of these little principalities that had been now totally broken up. There is no central power anymore. They all have to pay tribute to the Mongols, who then moved off to warmer climes where their camels don't have to go through the snow. And the goal of the Mongols was to make sure that each of these little Russian principalities, little statelets, stayed weak. They weren't interested in wiping them out, but they did want to make sure that no one of them got powerful enough to actually challenge, because the Mongols liked their source of money. So over time, as again the Mongols began to weaken, the various groups who had now been split off from Kiev began to assert themselves. And the main effect of the Mongol invasion was that the center of this Russian Slavic culture moved from Kiev to Moscow. And a lot of that had to do with this guy, Ivan III. So we're now in 1450. So the Kievan Rus has been gone for over 100 years. And there's this Principality of Muscovy, centered on a little village in Moscow, way up in the northern frozen wasteland. And Ivan III managed to throw off the Mongol rule around Moscow. He didn't throw off the entirety of what is today Russia, just enough for him around Moscow. And he basically passed a law that any of the other dukes in his area would have to, on their death, will their land to him. They couldn't pass it down to their children. His idea was that I will then keep all of these little dukelings who are under me, I will keep them from having their own separate tiny statelets, and I will then increase my own power, which worked fairly well. Mind you, being that this is in the Russian style, as we will see even down to the present day, basically if the Duke said no, he convinced them by force. So wasn't much chance of the Dukes to go against this. At least they got to keep their land while they were still alive. So this picture basically shows it's a much more recent painting, but basically shows an emissary from the Mongols coming in and giving Ivan a letter. Ivan is stomping on the letter and saying, nope, we're not going to follow you anymore. We are going to now become independent. So this is the moment, in a very romanticized view, when Ivan threw off the Mongol horde. All right. Moving forward another 100 years or so, we get to another Ivan. This one is called Ivan the Terrible. And actually in Russian, his name means more like Ivan the Impressive, Ivan the Awesome, in the former use of the word that he inspired awe. not so much terrible as in that he was evil, although admittedly in his later years he did somewhat descend into madness, as this painter has captured in the picture here. So it's time that we introduce you to a couple of words. First of which is boyar. In English we would spell that B-O-Y-A-R. And these are the upper level of nobility in the Russian society. And the boyars are the ones who would be right underneath the emperor, right underneath the king. And traditionally, these boyars had a lot of independence. Ivan comes in, and if you look in your textbook where the map shows how Russia expanded, you'll notice that Ivan does not have an overly large territory, especially when you think of Russia as this massive thing. He didn't have a huge amount of territory. He was still working on consolidating his power in his own base, and his main goal was to reduce the power of the boyars. So he would trick the boyars, he would enter into treaties with them and say, okay, I'll be your protector. And then when they let down their guard, he would attack them and kill them and take their land. Sometimes he would pass a law saying, if your last name has a vowel in it, I get your land. Okay, that sort of thing. That he would do whatever he could to basically put down the power of the boyars, and he actually had enough military backing to be able to do this. And every time he managed to get the land of one of these boyars, it made him that much stronger, and it made it harder for all the rest to resist him. So he is the one who eventually pushed the Mongols entirely out of what is today European Russia and opened up the way to expand from Moscow down to the east and to the south. So as he got further along in his reign, and he ruled for a fairly long period of time, he would get into these bouts where he would become incredibly violent, or he would simply take action against someone for no real necessarily good reason. And one time, after he had been mistreating a lot of his subjects, his son, who was next in line to the throne, came to him and basically said, Dad, you've got to watch out. These guys could eventually rise up and take over. Whereupon Ivan, who you'll notice in this painting is holding his stick, he takes this stick and he kills his son with it in the heat of the argument. And then, of course, according to the story, he realizes, oh my goodness, what have I done? And this was his only heir to the throne. So this led to what was called the Time of Troubles. Basically, a 20-year civil war that happened because of what Ivan did in killing off his only heir. So during this time, there were a lot of people who came along and said, oh yes, I am the third son of Ivan IV. And he would get some people to follow him, and then they would realize, no, you're just some shmoo from the steppes. You have no real claim. And so then, of course, they'd kill him. And another guy would come along and try to claim the power, and you would have boyars then realizing this is our chance now to come back and get the sort of things that we had lost. It also happened during this time that a famine came along that killed about a third of the population of Russia. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was at this point the largest country in Europe, saw this as their opportunity to try to get some land back at the expense of Moscow or Russia, and so they also entered into a war. So there was troubles on all sorts of different fronts. And eventually the boyars decided, enough of this, we need to come back and have a good, powerful leader. Okay, we'll see this again and again in Russian history. They get rid of this autocratic leader, descend into chaos, and they say, you know what, we just really need a powerful leader to tell us what to do. And so the boyars elect this fellow by the name of Michael Romanov. He was 16 years old, and his family was related to this Rurik dynasty. I think he was like the second cousin once removed of Ivan IV, or the sister-in-law's cousin's brother, something like that. And so he was related to the family, but there were some advantages about him. One, he's 16. He's not going to have any uppity thoughts about actually ruling. So the boyars say, yeah, this guy could be one that we could still have an influence in. His father had been captured by the Poles and was being held prisoner in Poland. And so that's even better. His dad isn't here to try to tell him what to do and to help guide him. So we can have a good ruler, and we can again be telling him, feeding him ideas that he'll then think are his own. And they choose him to be the Tsar of Russia. Tsar is a word that Ivan IV claimed, Ivan the Terrible, which basically comes from the Latin word Caesar. So here we've spelled it T-S-A-R. You will also often see this spelled C-Z-A-R, which is a little closer to the word Caesar. Incidentally, it's also where we get the German word Kaiser. Basically showing that, yes, Moscow is now the third Rome. First Rome was obviously Rome, second Rome being Constantinople, and now Moscow will be the third Rome. And so we will, since we are the emperors of this third Rome, we will choose the term Tsar to show just how great we really are. So Michael Romanov established a dynasty that would last in Russia until 1917. And his first very important, powerful offspring was Peter the Great, 1689. So 70-some years after Michael had been elected, along comes Peter the Great. Up until this point, Russia had been very much inward-looking. If they were interested in expansion, they were interested in going south or going east. They had always looked to Constantinople for their culture, for their inspiration. And Constantinople, by this point, was nothing to speak of. It had been conquered by the Fourth Crusade. It had been conquered by the Turks. And Peter the Great is the first Russian to really look and say, maybe we should become a Western country. Maybe we should try to learn from Western Europe. By 1689, Western Europe is fully out of the Middle Ages. So the beginnings, the hints of the Industrial Revolution are on the horizon. The Agricultural Revolution is starting up. And you have a lot of things, the scientific advances are going at great paces. And Peter looks at his own, what is becoming a backward country, and says, we need to actually become a Western country. Up until now, we've been an Eastern country. We've looked toward Constantinople. Let's look toward the West. And so he went on what he called the Grand Embassy. And his idea was, I think I should go and tour through the West, and I will do it incognito. I will go places like the Netherlands, and I will go to England, and I will learn how it is that they have become these centers of learning, especially centers of maritime trade. The Dutch and the British at this point had two of the most lucrative money-making trading empires, all centered on the sea. And so Peter says, I am fascinated with the sea. I'm fascinated with how we could, as Russia, could make money off of this. And so he then spends his time traveling supposedly incognito. Problem is, he's 6'8", and he speaks Russian. The other language that he speaks are heavily accented. He travels with this large, very Russian entourage. And so it is obvious to everyone that this is Peter the Great. And he would then get dressed up in like simple workman clothes and go down to the wharf and try to fit in and say, oh, could I work as an apprentice? Well, everyone knew this is Peter the Great, just sort of play acting, dressing up in clothes. And so people would play along with him and said, oh, yes, Mr. Peter, well, come along, we'll help you out, we'll show you some things. And it was never much of a secret. The Dutch were not too much help. He went down, he worked a little bit, and spent some time looking at the way that the Dutch built their ships. But the Dutch built them all by memory, basically. They didn't have plans written down. They didn't have it scientifically written out how you build these ships. So he gave up on them and went to England, where he settled himself in, incognito, so to speak, or at least he was kind of trying, and with his massive entourage, who succeeded in trashing several different places that they were staying. Took a tour of London this last spring break, and our tour guide, as we were going down along the river, pointed out the various places where Peter the Great had actually trashed that house when he stayed there. But while he was there, the British did use blueprints. They did use calculations and measurements, and so he was able to learn a lot about shipbuilding. Eventually got to the point where the King of England, sort of to try to give Peter the hint, cut off the food rations that he was sending to his several dozen strong crowd, and eventually basically started saying things to Peter like, so, Peter, when do you think you'll be going? So, Peter, do you think you might be leaving next week? And eventually, Peter, especially once he wasn't getting any more free food, decided, okay, I've learned enough, and he went back to Russia. Now, the problem is, Russia doesn't have a warm water port. They had ports up on the Arctic Ocean. They didn't yet have any ports on the Black Sea. And so Peter said, we need to have a warm water port, one that we can access throughout the year. And so he chose what would eventually become St. Petersburg, which at this point was simply a swamp. And in 1703, he founded St. Petersburg, and cities have these names that are given. Paris, the city of love, you have all sorts of kind of other cities, the Venice of such and such. Well, St. Petersburg is called the city built on bones, because Peter wanted to be like the enlightened West, but in his heart he was still very much a Russian, and your serfs, your workers, basically have no value. He would send these workers to the site where he wanted St. Petersburg, and it was literally just a swamp. So they had to carve out canals and lay down foundations, drive logs into the water so that they could eventually build land on top of it. And vast quantities of people died. There are even stories where they would send workers, basically go along and come to a village and say, okay, you guys are all moving out and going to go help build St. Petersburg. They had no clue about building. They would arrive there and say, okay, we're going to excavate this area. The people wouldn't have tools. They just have to dig the dirt out with their bare hands, carry it in the front of their shirt to the dumping pile. Incredibly inefficient, incredibly disorganized with regards to food and health, and the weather there. I mean, this is warm, Russian speaking, but it's still a nasty place if you're camping out in a swamp. So huge numbers of people died. And at this point, the Russian peasantry began to slide more and more into serfdom. It just so happens that at this point in Western Europe, we have something that's called the Commercial Revolution, and feudalism is almost entirely dead in Western Europe. People begin to realize wealth is not based on land. This is the Western European standpoint. They say wealth is built on buying and selling. And so it didn't become important how much land you have, like it had in the past, how many people you had working your land. It became important how much stuff you could make, how much of that stuff you could sell. And in this system, you really don't need serfs. In fact, serfs become a bit of a drain on your finances. And so at this point, serfdom in the West is almost gone. Serfdom in Russia becomes more and more overwhelming. And this would last up until the middle of the 1800s, where Russian serfs become far worse off than anything that Eastern Europe had. So Peter the Great was followed by some not so great people. And the next important person is Catherine the Great. And she was actually a German princess. Her real name was Sophie. And she then married the crown prince, who also, at this point, happened to be German. Because Peter the Great said, you know what, instead of marrying within this boyar society, we need to do like what the other royal families of Europe do and find husbands and wives for our kids amongst the royalty of Europe. And so he had then made these treaty arrangements through various of the German royal families. At this point, Germany was made up of dozens of countries, so there were lots of royalty to choose from. And it just so happened that the crown prince at this point had grown up speaking German in Kiel, had not expected that he would end up in the throne, in line to the throne of Russia, but due to deaths and war and what have you, he ended up being next in line to the Roman throne. And he married a German princess whose name was Sophie. She changed her name to Catherine when she became Eastern Orthodox. And it just so happened that a few months after they came to the throne, she led a coup against her husband and threw him in prison, where he then accidentally died. And yeah, nobody ever dug too deeply to see just how much of an accident it really was. But she says it was an accident, so yeah, who's going to argue with the most powerful person in the country? She continued this policy of westernization. She was again German. She knew what life was like in the West, and she corresponded with Voltaire. She was very much into the Enlightenment, and she was very interested in what the latest ideas in philosophy and government and things like that were coming out of the West. And then the French Revolution happened. And she saw this, one of the most ancient and wealthiest rulers, this dynasty in Europe, suddenly get overthrown by the people. The heads rolling everywhere. And this sort of made her take a little less enlightened stance to the whole situation. And she went back on a lot of her reforms. Two of the things that we can probably important for her reign. Again, if you look at the map, she expanded Russia a lot. She is taking Russia and pushing it as far as she can go. If there is a people group that is one that looks like she could overtake them, then she's willing to do that. She is also one that she had no interest in getting these serfs, the common people, giving them the sort of freedom that allowed the French Revolution to happen. And so she continues oppressing the serfs, makes it impossible for them to freely move about. It eventually came to the point where you could actually buy and sell serfs. They didn't call them slaves, but whoever owned that serf had the total right to do whatever they wanted, except you couldn't actually kill your serf. But you could take your serf and move this serf off the land and have him or her work in your household. You could sell your serf to a different boyar, and even if this serf happened to be married and have kids, it didn't matter, you would sell that serf. So in a lot of ways, it was very similar to slavery. We'll talk about that a little more later on. So after the French Revolution, which hopefully you guys have had at some point in the past, we had a fairly important person named Napoleon. Comes along, basically says, I'm a friend of the rebellion, and then he says, yeah, actually, I kind of like the whole idea of a king. Oh, I'll even go better than that. I'll make myself emperor, and I think I want to conquer the world. So he pretty much conquers Europe. He makes this thing called a continental system, which was a mess. And Russia says we're not going to go along with the continental system. You don't have to worry about what all that was. But the important thing is, in 1812, Napoleon decides, I have to teach Russia a lesson. They are not obeying me, and I'm going to show them what happens when people do not obey me, the great ruler Napoleon. And so he invades Russia. And people talk about, oh, he invaded Russia in winter. He didn't. He invaded Russia in June. It just takes a while. And this is a chart that shows how many people Napoleon started with. So the width of the line shows how many soldiers he had at that point. At the beginning, this one lists 422,000 soldiers. And you can see as they go along, he sends a little group off here. Okay, he sends a little group off here. Okay. And as they go along, they're losing people. So you have various battles. So for example, here you can see that there are some people that were lost. And what the Russians would do, they realized we have a vast amount of space. We don't need to get involved with Napoleon in a pitched battle. Napoleon is the greatest general that was alive at the time. Some may say he's the greatest general that was. He knew tactics. He could look at a valley and know where to put his soldiers. And so the Russians were smarter than that. They said, we're not going to go in and set ourselves a battle where Napoleon can defeat us. We'll just keep retreating. And since Napoleon, in order to actually beat the Russians, has to fight them at some point, is never able to get into this decisive battle. He makes it all the way to Moscow. And his goal is, he now, at this point, winter is approaching. And if I can get to Moscow, then we can set up, we can winter in Moscow, and we'll conquer that. Well, by the time he gets there, the Russians had taken everything of value in Moscow and simply left. So Napoleon gets to Moscow, there is nothing there that he can use for his troops to overwinter. And you'll notice he has a fraction of the amount that he had when he started. So he is faced with the fact that I could now spend the winter in Moscow, or I could try to make it back to France, because at this point, if I stay here for the next however many months, there is no way that I'm going to be able to feed my men. So he decides to turn around, and this black line here shows, as they are retreating, how their numbers are decreasing. This line here shows you the temperature below 0. So this is 0, this line here. And so here it is dropped down to -20. And so during this cold snap, you can see that they've lost a few people. And notice that the river crossings, they tend to lose people. He gets reinforcements coming in, but then again, he pretty much loses all of those reinforcements at this river crossing. Temperature drops down to -30 Celsius by the time they get here. He makes it out, including this little bits of reinforcements that came in. At this point, he was down to 4,000 people out of the 422,000 that he had left. He eventually makes it out with around 10,000 soldiers. So this was a stunning and decisive defeat for Napoleon. So you can zoom in a little bit more. If we look at just incredibly how quickly he was losing men. Napoleon never recovered from this, and this then sets him up for his downfall, and it totally restructures what Europe would look like for the next 100 years, basically until World War I. And we will call that the end, well, the end of part 1. And tomorrow we'll pick up again, post-Napoleon, what we could consider, I guess, to be called modern Russia. So tune in again tomorrow for part 2, why Russia looks the way it does today, and a little bit about the Soviet Union in between.